Confirm that we're south of 3730 north.
Confirm, sir.
Confirm south, sir. Clear to launch the SHAR, sir.
This is the winged fist of the Royal Navy, the SHAR, Sea Harrier FRS, Fighter Reconnaissance Strike Aircraft. Born 30 years ago, it's still the Navy's only frontline fighter, a design that hasn't been bettered in 3 decades. It's still the only vertical takeoff VTOL fighter in the world, powered by a Pegasus engine with enough muscle to lift a bus on raw thrust. 10 tons of thrust delivered through swiveling nozzles. A combination of precision and brute force that gave Britain's task force the winning edge in the skies over the South Atlantic.
It's a lot of fun, actually. There's a lot of different things you can do with it, takeoff and landing, especially with its rotatable nozzles. And this makes it a particularly good challenge because you have to think about what you're going to do each stage of takeoff or landing quite carefully before you put the throttle up. Otherwise, you can find yourself running into a bit of trouble. And it's not an aeroplane you can get blasé with because it's got a few nasty tricks up its sleeve.
Once you're in the VTOL regime, which is the hover regime, it is a very complex aeroplane. And if you don't obey the golden rules, then she will bite very hard and very quickly. But in conventional flight, she's just like any normal aeroplane. In fact, she's probably even better than some because in combat manoeuvring, you can take her right to the edge of the limit. She'll tell you exactly what she's doing. She'll probably depart controlled flight. As soon as you take the correct recovery action, she recovers each time. Very safe and very nice aeroplane.
Well, operating to ships has been the greatest challenge for me in my flying career, and also the most enjoyable part of it. We do operate in weather conditions that would be unsuitable for conventional carrier-borne aircraft that the Americans use, and so we can actually fly in sea states which would be out of limits for them, which is a source of great pride, I think, for the Fleet Air Arm.
It's more complicated than a lot of fixed-wing aircraft by virtue of the fact that you have an almost infinite variety of ways of getting airborne and landing again. A normal conventional aircraft gets airborne at a set speed and lands at a set speed. With the Harrier, you have from zero, i.e. vertical takeoff and landing, all the way through to fully conventional, which can be up around about 160 miles an hour.
So let's take a look at the basics of this remarkable plane.
Large engine intakes with the Pegasus engine in it, giving us 21,000 pounds of thrust, which obviously the thrust must be greater than the weight of the aircraft, the fuel and the weapon systems that we're carrying, otherwise we won't be able to do any vertical takeoffs or landings. And whilst you are in the hover, of course, the engine needs a lot more air, and these doors open to provide that air. Moving further back down, these are the cold nozzles, one either side, and these provide half the thrust for the aircraft in the hover by pointing directly down. The pilot can actually select them downwards from the cockpit. This is the hot nozzle at the back, provides the other half of the thrust for the aircraft in the hover. There's also a bleed system which provides stability for the aircraft in the hover, which goes to the puffer ducts on the wingtips, the tail and under the nose. This is one of the ducts I was talking about. It provides the aircraft with yaw control in the hover. In wing-borne conventional flight, the rudder actually provides yaw control, but in the hover, the pilot moves the rudder to the left. This will be covered up. The other ducts will open, and the aircraft will yaw to the left. On this side of the aircraft, we have two pylons. The inner pylon is used for carrying fuel, in this case a 100-gallon fuel tank. It can also be used for carrying Seagull, which is an anti-ship missile. On this pylon, we have the carrier bombs light store used for carrying practice bombs. It can also be used for carrying up to 2 Sidewinder missiles. We also carry 2 Aiden cannons. 30mm rounds are carried on those, around about 120 rounds, and fire 1,200 to 1,400 rounds per minute. And this, of course, is the cockpit. The aircraft's very similar to most conventional aircraft designed in the 70s, however it differs mainly in that we have this nozzle lever here which we can use for viffing. Working left to right, we have the throttle to make the aircraft go faster or slower. Radio equipment, airspeed indicator, artificial horizon, barometric altimeter. Up here we have our head-up display, which is an excellent piece of kit for us, our radar panel, and down here we have all avionic kit, which is far too complicated to explain at the moment. The head-up display provides the pilot with all the information he needs to fly the aircraft, as well as providing him with a weapons sight for air-to-air, air-to-ground, Seagull attacks, and air-to-missile shots. Well, that's the Sea Harrier. Altogether an amazing concept for a fighting machine.
The main role for the Sea Harrier is it's a fighter, and our main task really is to kill the shadow, or to make the shadow go away, which is in the threat, the badge of the bear, the Russian long-range maritime reconnaissance. If we can make him keep clear of the fleet and not actually find the fleet, then we've achieved the task, because he won't be able to pass targeting information to the submarines or other aircraft with missiles. So hopefully we can, that's the main job, is to make sure they don't attack the fleet. And it was quite strange the first time I intercepted a Russian. We were sitting alongside as he was shadowing the fleet, and he was looking out the back of his bear, and he looked just like me, and I obviously looked just like him. We didn't have horns or anything, and we had the usual waves and smiles and everything at each other, but he's doing his job and I'm doing mine.
That almost amicable relationship might well be shattered by this brute, the Soviet Union's Sukhoi 27, codenamed Flanker. The Sukhoi's twin engines developed 60,000 pounds of thrust, carrying it to 40,000 feet in less than a minute. It can carry 10 air-to-air missiles.
I wouldn't like to fight the flanker. Obviously, our main job, in fact, would be, if they came in with the badge of the bear, is still to press for the main threat and hopefully not get taken out by the fighter.
But the manoeuvrability of the Harrier, created by vectored thrust through the nozzles, gives it an edge against any aerial opponent, even more powerful, more modern fighters.
You can use it to basically point the aircraft almost wherever you want to point it, which is extremely useful when you're talking about fairly close-in weapons systems, which need to be pointed in the region of the target aircraft before you can make use of them. We can maintain control of the aircraft right down to very low speeds, and at extremely low speeds, point the aircraft, as I say, almost anywhere fairly quickly to get a missile or a gunshot off.
The other technique is the one which is sort of widely misunderstood, is the VIF maneuver, where we are supposed to fly behind the man. It can work if it's used at the right time, using the right technique. If it's not done at the right time, all we do is solve the bad guy's problem. Well, if I happen to, which happens, get somebody in behind me, if I'm negating his missile shots and he's now coming in for a guns kill, then if I at the right time, so he's at the right range, closing at a good closure rate, I can basically put the nozzle straight into the braking stop, and hopefully with such a deceleration that he will be unable to stay inside the same plane, so he will have to fly through, which means that I then am able to fly after him and hopefully shoot him down, rather than the other way around. If I misjudge the closure rate, then all I do is I become stationary, and he says, "Thank you very much." Dead.
Practical experiments on vertical takeoff machines began in Britain in 1953 with Rolls-Royce's Flying Bedstead, powered by two turbojets with their tailpipes pointing downwards. The Americans had started 2 years earlier, developing planes that sat on their tails for takeoff and then bunted over into horizontal flight. That was a crucial problem, controlling the aircraft during the fraught transition from vertical to horizontal flight. Back in Britain, Short's brothers had developed the SC-1, the forerunner of the Harrier. It had 5 engines, 4 for lift, 1 for forward flight. Vertical takeoff requires a power-to-weight ratio of 1.2. To achieve this, many early experimental types were multi-engined, but that leaves no room within overall weight limits for weapons payloads or avionics. The answer was thrust vectoring, being able to rotate the outlet casing of a single engine through 90 degrees. It was that breakthrough in design that led to the Harrier. The first prototype to fly was the P1127, at first held down by wire tethers.
The aircraft had tethers at the wingtips and at the tail, allowing it initially to go to 1 foot in altitude and later on to about 4 feet before we did the free hovering on the airplane. The situation was made rather more bizarre because I had been to Germany to demonstrate the Hunter, and the driver taking me home to my hotel had failed to go around a corner, drove me into a tree, smashed my ankle, and I finished up with a Potts fracture, 3rd degree. Cut a long story short, with a lot of persuasion, a certain amount of determination, the medical board, the Central Medical Board, Royal Air Force, gave me a category unique in aviation history, namely fit civil test pilot, tethered hovering only. So it was a strange start to find myself hopping up the steps to get into the cockpit and flying with my plastered ankle covered in a red sock. Everything was weight reduced. 700 pounds was stripped off the aeroplane, and it looked very undignified. It looked really rather elephant-like, especially with the big elephant's ears on the sides and so forth. And to assist the team, I also went on a dart and lost about 2 stone of weight. In a period of 1 month, we had done something like, I think the figure was 22 liftoffs, and then we were allowed to cut the tethers loose. My medical category was improved to hovering freely, not above 4 feet. And that was the first major milestone in the history of the airplane. On my 40th birthday, life began at 40 for me. Of course, life was full of excitements, as you can imagine. There was never a dull moment. And the very first engine run we carried out, the airplane or engine caught fire due to a leaky fuel cock. We had great difficulty in removing the big silencing ears that surrounded the exhaust nozzles, and we nearly lost the airplane before we started it. When we were doing our preliminary taxiing, the judder from the main wheels triggered off the natural frequency of the undercarriage, and the undercarriage snapped off like a carrot.
On that occasion, there was no major damage to the prototype Harrier, but at other times, things could go drastically wrong. Bill Bedford, the test pilot who nursed P1127 through all the major landmarks in its early history, still has fond memories of the plane, now in the RAF Museum at Hendon.
It's like greeting an old friend, this is. Getting back in here again after all these years.
He remembers the scepticism with which naval chiefs greeted the plane, especially their worries about its effects on aircraft carriers.
There were talks about, you'll buckle the deck, you'll blow the crew overboard, you'll deafen the captain, and what about the cliff edge effects? So it was with some trepidation that we took off from the snow-covered airfield at Dunsfold on the 8th of February, 1963. And at high noon, I arrived over HMS Ark Royal No. 4, quick fly past, decelerating transition, and was fortunate to be the first man to land vertically aboard a ship with a fixed-wing jet D-style airplane. We couldn't possibly, with the wildest imagination in our minds, envisage that this would eventually lead to the Harrier performing in the Falklands with the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force, that it would succeed in destroying 28 enemy aircraft without the loss of a single Harrier in air combat.
of April 1982, and the Sea Harrier embarked for its sternest test. 8,000 miles away, Argentina has disdainfully seized the Falkland Islands. The carrier Hermes, only days before bound for the scrap heap, is now bound for the South Atlantic, carrying 12 Harriers of 800 Squadron. Invincible carries 8 Harriers of 801 Squadron. 20 planes against the Argentinians' 100 are all Britain has to protect its fleet. On the long voyage south, men, machines and armaments are put through their paces. Sidewinder missiles. And deadly cluster bombs. Three days south of the Ascension Islands, and the Harriers are scrambled for the first time to ward off Argentinian spy planes. After that, the Harrier Squadron is on permanent standby. 2-hour shifts in the cockpit on the flight deck, ready to scramble. Harriers flew 1,000 missions during the Falklands War. The shield they provided for the fleet was so impenetrable, the Argentinian Navy never attempted a full-scale attack. They stayed holed up in port. On the 1st of May, the Harriers began their first airstrike against the airfield at Port Stanley, now in Argentinian hands. The airfield never closed, but the psychological effect on the occupying forces of continual battering must have been incalculably valuable. On their return, journalists were forbidden to say how many Harriers had taken part in the raid, but they counted them out, and they counted them all back in. Not a single Harrier was shot down by Argentinian planes. RAF pilot David Morgan had a narrow escape. Argentinian fire left his tailplane with some extra ventilation.
My first bomb probably took out an aircraft which was on the northern side of the airfield, a little light aircraft, and then the remaining 2 rolled across the airfield into the pan, which was actually full of smoke and flames already at this stage.
What did it look like?
The airfield itself was just the airport buildings were just a very large area of fire and smoke and dust. You couldn't actually pick out very little detail in there because there was so much.
Could you see people on the ground?
No, you couldn't see any people. I think they were all pretty well down foxholes, but you could see a lot of guns firing.
As British troop landings began, Harriers provided essential cover against the Argentinian A4 Skyhawks and Mirages. Reinforced by 6 RAF Harriers and 8 more Sea Harriers from 809 Squadron, the fleet's air arm was now complete. Together, they put 28 Argentinian aircraft out of action for a loss of only 10 Harriers. But then the A4s inflicted a terrible loss, striking fearfully at Sir Galahad, carrying hundreds of members of the 1st Welsh Guards. Scenes of carnage and incredible bravery that were witnessed by Harrier pilots like David Morgan in the skies above Bluff Cove.
It was the evening of the 8th of June, and I'd been on alert 5 on the deck of Hermes, sitting in the cockpit. I think I was probably asleep, actually. I tended to sleep quite a lot in the cockpit. And I was scrambled to go over the islands. and all I knew was that there'd been an air raid, and it wasn't until I was getting close that I realized that there'd been an attack on some ships in the area of Bluff Cove. And we took over the combat air patrol over Bluff Cove while they were trying to set up the Rapier missiles. And we'd been there for about 45 or 50 minutes, I suppose, two of us. Fuel was getting quite low. The carrier was quite a long way out. It was starting to get dark. We'd lost the option of going into the tin strip at San Carlos because it was getting dark and there was no way of getting in there. There were no lights on the strip. Looking down, I'd noticed one of our small landing craft had been coming around from Chesil Sound and heading up towards the rest of the ships, which we could see burning in Bluff Cove. And in the turn, I looked down and saw an aircraft about 300 yards short of this ship, obviously going in to attack it. And I just yelled out that I'd seen something and dived down after it from about 10,000 feet. I saw the lead aircraft attack the landing craft and miss it. I then saw a second aircraft running in for the attack and decided to take him first. I was still accelerating down the hill, still about 4 or 5 miles away at this stage, and I saw him hit the back of the ship with a bomb of some sort, a very large explosion. So I knew he'd done a lot of damage and probably killed a lot of people. At that stage, I started to get very angry. While I was converting onto his tail, the third guy came out from underneath me, so I dropped in on him initially. I was almost in firing range when I saw out of the corner of my left eye a fourth aircraft, which would have been in a position to threaten me if I hadn't gone for him first. So I pulled the aircraft across to the left, and at this stage we were down to probably around about 100 feet above the water, going much faster than the Harrier was ever designed to go. And locked my port missile onto him, fired it, and the missile coming off the rails just threw my aircraft over onto the right-hand wingtip, past the vertical, which is a hell of a shock. But the missile went straight up his jet pipe and blew him to pieces. Very, very little debris of any sort hit the water. It was very small bits. Within about 4 or 5 seconds, I lined the other missile up, locked it onto the guy in front, the number 3, fired at him, and he'd seen the first guy explode and was turning gently back left to try and find out what was going on, I guess. And I think he saw my missile come off. It makes quite a lot of smoke. He then broke right and tried to run away, which was exactly the right thing to do. But I was going a lot faster than he was, and I was fairly close, and the missile just took the back end of his aircraft off completely. It hit just behind the cockpit, and the back end of the aircraft disappeared totally. The canopy and the front of the cockpit then rotated through about 90 degrees and went straight into the water within probably half a second. He was down about 50 or 60 feet at this stage. I felt great exhilaration at that stage, having got rid of 2 of them. I was then running through for the front 2, one of which was the guy I really wanted to get because I'd seen him hit the landing craft. At this stage, the second guy I'd shot down actually managed to get out of the aircraft, used his seat, and the parachute opened right in front of me, and in fact he nearly went down my intake. He went just over the left-hand wing. I then went forward for the remaining 2, who are now fairly close together, running up towards Goose Green. Unfortunately, as I fired my second Sidewinder, the head-up display, which has all the weapon aiming symbology on it, went out, so I just had a black windscreen, no gun sight. So I flew into about 300 or 400 yards, trying to hit one of these A4s with guns, and missed, unfortunately. Meanwhile, my number 2 had seen my 2 explosions, hadn't seen the target aircraft at all, and then suddenly saw another aircraft flying very low across the water with explosions all round it. And he thought that someone was firing at me and pulled for me to break up out of the way. I, at that stage, ran out of bullets, and so just pulled vertically. He saw me go up and realized that the aircraft he'd seen previously was a target. So he locked it with one of his Sidewinders and fired, and got the third one. The fourth one got away to take the story home. We then discovered we were desperately short of fuel and spent 30-odd very anxious minutes on the way back to Hermes and landed with a couple of minutes fuel remaining.
When Port Stanley was finally retaken, the Harrier had played its part in full and proved its fighting ability. HMS Invincible, displacement 19,500 tons, top speed 28 knots, range 5,000 miles, complement over 1,000 crew. Invincible was launched in 1977 and completed a 2-year modernisation in 1989. She can carry 9 Westland Sea King anti-submarine helicopters, 3 airborne early warning Sea Kings and 8 or 9 FRS-1 Sea Harriers. Her flight deck is 550 feet long, longer than a football field. Harriers approaching to recover onto Invincible transit from 200 knots of wing-borne speed to a vertical hover in 30 seconds. The approach is not direct to the flight deck, but to a hover point slightly to port. The pilot then slides the plane over the flight deck and makes a vertical landing. This procedure reduces the workload on the pilot and means the Harrier can land in foul weather that will force a conventional jet to divert or ditch. The plane the Navy had originally spurned, it entered seaborne service in the US Marine Corps first, now seems entirely at home. In exercises flying combat missions against other aircraft types, the Harrier has an impressive record. Even against fighters that are faster and better armed, like the F-16, the kill ratio is always about 3-to-1 in the Harrier's favour. Harrier pilots know the plane's small size makes it impossible to spot visually from distances greater than 3 miles. Once the engagement becomes visual, with VIFing, the Harrier can decelerate very rapidly, point its weapons and accelerate away. To complete Invincible's air group are Sea King airborne early warning helicopters, landing with their radar equipment folded back behind the starboard landing gear. Invincible also carries helicopters equipped for anti-submarine operations, again Sea Kings. Indeed, one of the ship's major roles is anti-submarine warfare, defending the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap in the North Atlantic against Soviet submarine penetration. Over a range of 900 miles, Sea Kings can detect and destroy submarines with a variety of equipment. They carry sea search radar and passive listening sonar buoys, which they lower into the sea. They can attack submarines either with target-seeking torpedoes or with depth charges. One of the Harrier's great advantages is the speed with which attacks can be launched. Once the order is given, it can be airborne within 2 minutes of an alarm being sounded. And unlike conventional jets, its takeoff does not require the ship to turn into the wind, a manoeuvre that can seriously impair response time.
Secure the hypergear for Harrier launch. Secure the hypergear.
Of course, as well as a working ship, Invincible is home to 660 sailors and 360 aircrew, all of whom have to be fed. The cuisine may not be cordon bleu, but it's a square meal. The sleeping arrangements aren't exactly the Ritz either, with 3 bunks to a cabin, but Invincible isn't an ocean liner.
Red has red all round. Red has red all round.
She was the first carrier to be fitted with a scissors lift to transport Harriers from the flight deck below for maintenance and repair. No one doubts the technological sophistication of a carrier like Invincible, but some people are asking, is this expensive capability needed in an era when relations between East and West are less tense than ever before?
The ship has very sophisticated command and control facilities, as well as an extremely flexible air group and good self-defense equipment. The air group can be varied to suit the task the ship is required to perform. And so I could see her forming the center of a task group which could operate worldwide in support of British interests.
It's such a complicated aeroplane, and there's so many different roles that you do. We're on to AFT2 now, which is learning how to fight the aircraft tactically, which is equally as hard.
I mean, I think it's certainly the best flying job you can get in this country, just because of the challenge of it. It's a very difficult airplane to fly, and you're not going to be stuck on a single airbase.
You've got to believe you're the best, haven't you, when you go up? Otherwise you won't do it.
But even if you're the best, you're still flying a plane close to the limits of technology. A Pegasus engine that's only marginally wrong, and in the delicate balance of the hover mode, you can suddenly lose power. They call it a pop surge. So there's much more to a squadron than pilots. For every hour that a Harrier spends in the air, it will need 6 to 8 here in the squadron's hangar for maintenance. The men who work on the plane are also trained by 899 Squadron. One reason for that is that the Harrier presents engineers with particular maintenance problems.
The Sea Harrier is a very complex aeroplane, very small aeroplane in overall size, and an awful lot of equipment packed very tightly into it, as you can see behind me here. The engine, probably one of the largest problems we have, largest single problem, is the fact the engine is buried within the aircraft. If we have an engine problem, which requires us to remove the engine, to do that we need to jack the aircraft, we then have to remove the wing and then remove the engine. As you can see, the one behind me is heavily dismantled at the moment, and that's in very deep maintenance. There's a lot of work in maintaining these aircraft by my maintenance men, and to ensure that we produce aircraft that are fit to fly and safe to fly, and that is really our greatest bottom line.
And for the future, there's a new Sea Harrier in development, the FRS-2. It's built round a new missile, the Advanced Medium-Range Air-to-Air Missile, ANRAM. This is radar-guided. Before launch, the Harrier's computers pass radar information about target positions to the missile's navigation system. After firing, the ANRAM steers itself onto the target with its own radar. The Navy decided to re-equip with ANRAMs after the Falklands, where sea-skimming missiles did so much damage to naval vessels. FRS-2 can carry 4 ANRAMs, 2 under the belly and 2 on the outer wing pylons. The missile has meant other changes. For example, it needs a new radar, Blue Vixen, which involves a change in the shape of its nose housing. And because the outer ANRAM protrudes well forward of the wing's leading edge, 8-inch extensions have been added to the wing to keep the aerodynamic centre within prescribed limits. Pilots will also find a new head-up display and a new autopilot in the cockpit. The ANRAMs and Blue Vixen give the Harrier the ability to shoot down planes or sea-skimming missiles beyond visual range. All in all, the changes make the FRS-2 a severely potent piece of kit.